tuned in to The Andrew Lawton Show.
Welcome back to The Andrew Lawton Show. The big cultural battle of the month is, will you admit that whatever institution or country you preside over is systemically racist? Whether it's the RCMP, a political party, Canada itself, universities, companies, everyone has to say that everything is systemically racist, and if you don't, you are just proving it, and that makes you a racist. This is the theme we've been talking about the last couple of shows, and more examples keep emerging of it. Well, the latest on the list is Laurier University, which the professor and president, Deborah McClatchy, recognizes has systemic racism on the campus. She has said in a letter to the Laurier community that Laurier needs to tackle its systemic racism in the school and across the country, and as such, Laurier has put forward an action plan for equity, diversity, and inclusion, and indigeneity. Now, there may be nothing wrong with some of the specific proposals that are called for, but it's based on something that hasn't actually been defined or established, which is Laurier actually systemically racist? And what does that mean? Well, only a little bit of pushback. Two professors, David Millard Haskell and William McNally, wrote an open letter saying, well, hang on, you haven't defined it, you haven't given any evidence, and what you're calling for has much broader implications than what you say it's about. This letter, of course, making waves because, well, like I said, if you deny systemic racism, you're part of the problem. Fantastic letter. It is published online at SAFS, the Society for Academic Freedom and Scholarship's website, safs.ca. One of the co-authors, Professor David Millard Haskell, joins me on the line now. David, good to talk to you. Thanks very much for coming on today.
It's my pleasure, Andrew. Thanks for having me.
Now, it's not to say you've been a shrinking violet from the free speech fight in general, certainly not at Laurier University. You were front and center when the Lindsay Shepherd controversy happened a couple of years back, and you've continued to stand up for free speech. But on this issue specifically, why did you decide to stick your neck out, especially in this climate where everyone's getting canceled, and put some criticism and scrutiny on this approach from your school's president?
Well, you have to choose your battles, and both Will and I have been really concerned about the drift within academia more generally, but also the drift within our own university, where empirical evidence is no longer being used in order to justify policies and messaging. And it seems that ideological conclusions are driving what is happening. And these ideological conclusions aren't based on good evidence. So this was an example of this, where our president said that she made the suggestion that systemic racism was on our campus. And not only that, she had an action plan to combat it. And we had to say, stop for a moment. You're not basing this on evidence. And so I think that there's a subtlety there even. We're saying, we're looking for your justification for the claim. We're not even saying your claim is wrong at this point, although the evidence that we've found would suggest it is. But what we want as a university, as a place that makes its living trying to advance knowledge, we want to see the evidence. We want to talk about the evidence. And so it was just standing up for the principles that are supposed to be the very lifeblood of a university that made us want to respond.
One of the points you and Professor McNally raised in your letter, which should have been an obvious one, it should have been the very first thing that something like this would have addressed, is the lack of a definition of systemic racism or of racism in general. And look, people may in their own minds know what racism is by way of example. Systemic racism is a bit more complex and I think has a lot more baggage and loading of that term, if I may. And there's no definition of it. McClatchy has said, yes, the school is systemically racist, but this did not come with an explanation as to how. And you point that out in your letter, which, again, and I am not downplaying what you're saying here, it should have been an obvious question that you raised, but no one else was.
And the irony here in the logic, Andrew, is that part of her action plan specifically says we need to define racism. So she's admitted right there, we don't have a definition, and yet she said earlier in this other missive that we're systemically racist. So that's the cart before the horse. This isn't how you work the scientific method. And my worry is there was language within her email that was referencing critical race theory, which is an offshoot of critical theory more generally. And it has a lot of really anti-academic ideas behind it. They suggest things like even empirical evidence is really promoting whiteness or white oppression. And this is right in the works of critical race theorists. And when you're saying that empirical evidence is oppression, what else do we have? What else do we have that we've been using since the Enlightenment to actually try and get away from issues of bias, but instead try and advance just neutral knowledge? So with systemic racism, what I'm worrying about is that it doesn't look like racism as we were taught, right? Racism, when we were younger, we were taught that if you say something that is negative about someone's skin color or about someone because of their skin color, if you had words or actions that were directly discriminatory related to someone's skin color, that's racism. And all of us agree that's terrible. It's sickening, and we should stand against it. But systemic racism, it's this different thing. And as I read the literature, and I read, we'll talk maybe about the single study that Dr. McClatchy used to justify this entire action plan.
Yeah, the being raced study. I was going to ask about that. So tell me why that's such a dangerous part of this.
Well, because it in fact explicitly says we're using critical race theory as the underpinnings for the study. And the idea of systemic racism, as it is applied within critical race theory, is that any disparity where Black people, people of color, or other people of color are at a disadvantage, where the numbers are negatively against them, that in and of itself is racism. Well, that's the fallacy of saying that correlation equals causation. And every researcher knows you don't do that. And yet here we have a university promoting this idea, this very anti-intellectual idea. So it's worrying. It's worrying when the keepers of knowledge abandon their job.
Yeah, and that's one of the big things, and I know this is not an academic point that I'm about to address here, but when we saw last week, for example, the RCMP Commissioner, Brenda Lucki, say the RCMP is systemically racist and failed to come up with an explanation for how she's reached that, and ended up passing the question off somewhere else. There's something that we see right now in this culture, and I know we're going to talk a little bit more about some of these broader issues, but where people are committed to the outcome before they even go through that process. So that's no different than McClatchy saying that, yes, we're systemically racist, and one of the things we're going to do is come up with a definition of what racism means. It's like they know that this is the right thing to say, or the so-called woke thing to say, and whatever other processes they need to go through to get to that point, they're going to go through, but they've already determined that's where they're going with it.
Right, and it short circuits what actually is the scientific method, because we want to test and retest. And so what actually happens when you begin to investigate this notion of systemic racism? So if you're listening to people talk about systemic racism, especially in the context of the George Floyd death, they often talk about it in terms of policing. But Will and I, in our letter even, we said the best empirical evidence shows that really the shooting of Black people is not racially motivated. We've got Roland Fryer at Harvard has done studies from 2018, it's some of the most current work we have, that shows there is not evidence of this racial motivation. Another fella at Michigan State University from 2019, Joseph Cesaro, I think I'm getting his name right, but he did a nationwide study, and he said, listen, it's a fact that a Black man in America is more apt to be shot by a Black police officer than a white police officer. There just isn't proof that this is racially motivated. So I look at that and I say, I want to know if there is some kind of racism happening, and let's stick with the police. I want to know about it so we can fix it. But these claims that are not based on evidence aren't getting us anywhere. They're getting us into a very dangerous place, a place that is not based on evidence, but it's based on a lot of thoughts about doing things that are pretty hostile.
And you point out in your letter something here. If this research was presented in class, it might be perceived as, quote, invalidating racialized people's experience of racism, unquote. Now, I should say I haven't read Fryer's research. It could be that there's a scientific point to be debated there, that you could, take aim through the scientific method at his findings, his methodology, whatever else you'd like. But you raise a point there that I don't think anyone can disagree, that there would be lots of people lined up, including at academic institutions, to have the discussion of that research taken off the table because of how it might make people feel.
And thanks for bringing that up, because really you've hit the nail on the head. This is what we're really concerned about. So the implications of what our president was saying, and also the study that she cites. The study itself, it was called Being Raced. It was produced by some undergraduate students under the tutelage of some mentors who were professors and also people from the Diversity and Equity Office. And the study itself, it's a phenomenological study. It wasn't a properly chosen sample in order to generalize from it. It was also of the sort that said anything that our participants say is racism, we are going to not question it. And that's fine for lived experience, but that's not fine when you're going to generate policy. So back to this notion about what that study also said. That study made some claims that said, from their perspective, if a professor, they called it a faculty perpetrator, if a professor were to quote from a study that went against the lived experience of a student, and even if the professor is quoting peer-reviewed excellent research, but it's going against the lived experience of the student in the classroom, that's racism. Well, suddenly you can't quote those studies. And we have to, as an institution, realize that we're going to say things that make people uncomfortable. That's what happens in a democracy. That's what happens should happen in a university where academic freedom is present. Now, I'm all for being civil, but absolutely we cannot stop talking about facts simply because they make people uncomfortable.
We are having a little bit of a technical glitch here. We were able to solve one, but we created another. So we've switched over to the phone now. David Haskell, thanks for sticking with us here. The recording system has already decided to take an early Canada Day holiday here. We were talking, though, about, a lot of the, I'll say frankly, shoddy research or non-existent research that's going into a lot of these declarations. And I appreciate something you mentioned earlier, which is to say that you're not even discounting that racism or systemic racism exists on campus. You're saying that there is no basis for the school's president to make those claims. And I wanted to ask you, because I thought that, there was a bit of a glimmer of hope a couple of years back when Lindsay Shepherd, I think, exposed a lot of what was going on. And you were front and center on that battle, as was your co-author of this letter, Dr. McNally. And we fast forward to the present time, and it seems like, any step you took forward was met with two or three steps back. So how do you think that the campus, by and large, is responding to this sort of thing? Because when you're making a claim that a school community is systemically racist, you're basically saying that everyone who is responsible for making up that campus is in some way complicit in racism.
Yeah, well, that is the implication there, and it is, again, that's an incredibly pejorative thing to say about a campus without having quantitative empirical data to back it up. And my worry, and you were drawing in the history about where Laurier has been and how in the Lindsay Shepherd affair, our administration and certain members of faculty were challenged, and they were challenged by by Lindsay, first of all, saying, you're saying things that aren't true. For example, the professor said to her that by airing a video that had appeared on public TV, she'd actually committed a hate crime, which wasn't true. Again, here we have claims that just are not based in empirical fact. So here we have another case just last week or 2 weeks ago when the president of the university says, we've got systemic racism on campus, creates a plan. I don't know why professors, we've got 550 full-time professors at Laurier, and they're supposed to be, most of them, expert in research methodology. Why did they not look at the letter in the same way that Will McNally and I did and said, this is just not good scholarship. This is just not empirically backed claims. So we've got, this is worrying, because when professors are willing to let unjustified claims be presented as fact, the university as an institution is worthless. Only 2 professors, Will and I, questioned the administration's claim of systemic racism on campus in the absence of a clear definition. There wasn't even a definition. And in the absence of empirical evidence. Where are the other professors?
Yeah, and that's the big problem here. I mean, it used to be not so long ago when academic freedom arose that there was, for the most part, I'd say, enough of, not even a collegiality, but enough of a self-awareness that professors would recognize, hey, even if I don't like the work that Haskell's doing over there, I know that if I condemn that, it could just as easily be me that's condemned next time around. And now that's not there. I mean, Western University, for example, where I went here in London, Ontario, they've now posthumously apologized for the work of one professor, Philippe Rushton, and you know, controversial or not, the idea that schools that used to protect tenure and academic freedom and academic inquiry and all of these things are now going quite brazenly in the other direction, which is to say, not just saying, hey, you know what, we think that, you know, someone should challenge this research, but saying you don't have a right to pursue this, or you don't have a right to champion this line of questioning.
Right, and it has far-reaching implications. You wonder if a professor or a group of professors, if faculty at a university are willing to say this empirical data, this factual material cannot be published, and they're attacking their own fellow professors, then what are they not willing to tell their students in the classroom? Is it only politically correct messages that our students are going to be hearing? Only messages that our professors think are agreeable? Because if that's the case, why go to university? If you're actually not going to get what might be the most compelling research, the most methodologically sound research, on the chance that it upset someone, well, then university just is worthless.
Where do you think this goes from here? Because I do feel like at a certain point, I mean, we see in the social justice world a lot of cannibalization on the left sometimes. People that have been able to check off all the boxes of being an ally to this group, to this group, to this group. They make one wrong step and boom, the mob turns on them. Do you think in academia this same sort of thing will happen in such a way that there's enough time for a collective pushback? Perhaps some of the people that have been adding fuel to these fires saying, you know what, we may have gone a bit too far. Do you think that ship has sailed?
I really think, sadly, the ship has sailed. There just is not the will on campus to push back against this. Again, just using the Laurier example, there are 550 full-time professors who would have seen there was no empirical evidence to back the president's claims, and only 2 professors challenged it. And here's the other thing. Apart from a media outlet in the United States, you are the only news organization who's thought that this was important.
Wow.
Even the media, and we've alerted media. And if you can't get the message out, There's just not the will. The media doesn't want to talk about it, that we have this crisis in education where empirical evidence is being suppressed. And then we've got the crisis in academia itself. And where does it go from here? It will get worse. And what we continue to see is that the progressives, and I'm using that term not in a favorable way, the left, the far left, who have taken over universities. And by that, this is an empirical fact as well. Joel Inberg did a study to see what percentage, and others, by the way, he's the only one that comes to mind, what percentage of university professors in North America are conservative-leaning or libertarian or classical liberal, and it's about 6% and dwindling. And when he asked the people who are self-identified progressive or liberal, would you not hire, would you purposely sink a candidate if you found out they were conservative? 25% said yes. And that was just the 25% who were willing to say yes, because that's something you don't want to admit to. The trouble is we've lost the universities, or the reality is we've lost the universities. And when nobody is there to be the counterpoint, when you don't have professors who have a different set of ideas, then you've got a monolith. And so the urge is to just get more of the same, and power corrupts, absolutely. We know this. So we'll continue to see these linguistic traps. And by that, what they'll do is they'll corrupt the definition of a word. This is the thing that they're doing just incessantly now, repeatedly now. They corrupt the definition of a word. They take a word like racism that had meaning, and it becomes systemic racism, and it doesn't mean what you thought it used to mean. Now it means if there's a disparity, if there's a difference in numbers, then suddenly that implies racism. So they do this, and they've done it with things like, I wrote a paper called Words Lose Their Meaning at Wilfrid Laurier. So rather than rehash that, I'd say to the listeners, take a look at that, and you'll see the numerous examples where this has happened. But it's a linguistic trap, and it's going to get worse.
Yeah, and I think those wording things are important, because you never want to get bogged down in semantics, but a lot of the time when you seed the language, you end up seeding a part of the battle. And I think the racist thing is a great example of this, because, a lot of people on the right, certainly those who work in new media, are used to being called racist. I mean, this word that used to carry a lot of weight now is, cookie, or the word "and," like it's said and you don't really think of it now, but it does still, to people that aren't in that world, have a lot of meaning. And when you put that qualifier on systemic, it means something even more. And systemic racism ergo requires systemic change. So before people have even, to go back full circle to how we started here, before people have even established what that meant, we're already 3 steps ahead on the action plan.
That's right, without the definition of racism itself. And we see this linguistic trap that then makes you you cannot question it, right? That's part of the linguistic trap. So now if I say, well, I'd like to see the evidence for systemic racism on campus, suddenly I'm a racist. And this is a really clever linguistic trap, because it means the other side never has to prove it.
And you, by virtue of asking that, prove that the system is racist, because only a racist system would allow such questions.
Exactly. Similarly, we've seen what's happened with white supremacy. The word, it used to mean people who belonged to the KKK, really despicable people. But it now means every Judeo-Christian value and all Western thought. As it's used by people who are promoting critical race theory, that now is white supremacy. And if that's white supremacy, what they're really looking for is to destroy society as we know it.
Well, even if it is just 2 of over 500 professors speaking up, I am so very grateful you two are there. David Millard Haskell, professor at Laurier University, a fantastic letter written alongside fellow professor William McNally. David, thank you so much for coming on today. Really great talking to you as always.
Yeah, it's really appreciated. Sorry about the glitches.
Yeah, no worries. It happens. Well, nothing's going to shut us up, right?
Hopefully no.
Thanks for listening to The Andrew Lawton Show. Support the program by donating to True North at www.tnc.news.